On May 18, 2026, at a technology conference in Minneapolis, a Microsoft executive walked on stage and said something that would have been unthinkable 25 years ago. His name is Brendan Burns, Microsoft's corporate vice president for Azure Cloud Native, and he announced that Microsoft was now shipping its own Linux distribution, a full commercially supported operating system built on Linux, available to every Azure customer on the planet. The crowd applauded. Some laughed in disbelief. Because in 2001, Microsoft's then CEO Steve Ballmer stood in front of a room of reporters and called Linux exact words. A cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. That man's company just shipped its own Linux. But here's the part that nobody in the mainstream press is connecting properly, and we're going to get to it in a moment. Because this isn't just an interesting footnote about corporate irony. This is a confession, a public, documented, financially significant admission that Microsoft's most important products, the ones that make the company its biggest money right now, cannot function without Linux. And once you see the numbers behind that admission, you cannot unsee them. Here is the number that should stop you cold. More than 2/3 of all customer computing cores running on Microsoft Azure, Microsoft's own cloud platform, are running Linux, not Windows. Linux. Microsoft published that figure themselves. Their own corporate vice president announced it from the stage. 2/3 of the workloads on the platform Microsoft sells to the world as its flagship cloud product are running an operating system. Microsoft once declared an existential threat to everything it stood for, but it gets more specific than that. Microsoft 365 RISE, the product millions of offices use every day for email, documents, and spreadsheets, sits on Linux infrastructure. GitHub, which Microsoft purchased for $7.5 billion in 2018, runs on Linux. And ChatGPT, the product that OpenAI built on a multi-billion-dollar Microsoft investment, the AI assistant that now has close to 700 million weekly users worldwide, runs on Linux. Brendan Burns said it himself from that stage in Minneapolis. The platform serving ChatGPT at scale across more than 10 million compute cores runs on Linux and Kubernetes. Microsoft's AI future, Microsoft's productivity suite, Microsoft's biggest developer acquisition. All of it running on the operating system Steve Ballmer once compared to a disease. And just 1 week before that announcement in Minneapolis, Microsoft had quietly released the source code for the Windows subsystem for Linux, the compatibility layer built into Windows that allows users to run Linux directly inside Windows. After years of the community building improvements without seeing the codebase, Microsoft opened it up. The engineers building Windows now needed the open source community to help them maintain their Linux integration. The question is why? Why would a company with Microsoft's resources, Microsoft's history, and Microsoft's pride end up here? And the answer to that goes back much further than most people realize and involves one engineer whose name you should know. We'll get to him shortly. To understand what happened, you have to understand where Microsoft stood at the turn of the millennium. In 2001, Windows was dominant in a way that is genuinely difficult to overstate. Windows ran on more than 90% of the world's personal computers. Microsoft's revenue was almost entirely tied to two products, Windows and Office. The company had just come through the Department of Justice antitrust case, which accused it of using its Windows monopoly to crush competitors. And Linux, this free, openly developed operating system built by volunteers and championed by engineers who believe software should belong to everyone, was beginning to attract serious attention. Steve Ballmer's cancer quote was not an accident. It was a strategy. Microsoft had internal documents, later leaked, describing what they called the Halloween documents. Internal memos from 1998 in which Microsoft engineers analyzed Linux as a genuine competitive threat and recommended tactics to undermine it. Those memos recommended spreading fear, uncertainty, and doubt, making businesses afraid of Linux, afraid of its licensing, afraid of its support model. And it worked for a while. But while Microsoft was playing defense, the world underneath them was shifting. Businesses were moving computing off their own servers and into shared data centers. The internet was growing at a rate that required infrastructure on a scale Windows was never designed to handle. Linux, with its flexibility, its low cost, and its stability at massive scale, was already running the servers that powered Google. It was running the infrastructure behind the web. Then in 2014, a man named Satya Nadella became Microsoft's CEO. Nadella had spent years inside Microsoft's cloud division. He understood what was actually running in data centers. He understood what developers actually wanted to build on. And he said publicly, almost immediately after taking the job, something that would have been career-ending under Ballmer: Microsoft loves Linux. People thought it was a marketing line. It was not. What it actually was the first honest acknowledgement that the cloud business, which Nadella correctly identified as Microsoft's future, was built on Linux whether Microsoft liked it or not. The question was whether Microsoft would fight that reality or profit from it. What happened next changed everything, and it happened faster than almost anyone expected. The single turning point, the decision that made everything after it inevitable, was Microsoft joining the Linux Foundation in 2016. At the time, that decision generated genuine controversy. The Linux Foundation is the organization that stewards the Linux kernel, the open source project at the heart of every Linux distribution on Earth. For years, Microsoft had been one of the most aggressive corporate opponents of open source software. When Microsoft walked through the door as a platinum member at a reported fee of $500,000 per year, many in the open source community were furious. Jim Zemlin, the Linux Foundation's CEO, acknowledged that furore himself when Microsoft announced Azure Linux 4.0 this year. He said directly from the stage, when Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation, there was this big conspiracy theory that somehow the Linux Foundation was undermining open source in partnership with Microsoft. The suspicion was understandable. Microsoft's earlier tactics against Linux had included funding a company called SCO that launched patent lawsuits against Linux users. Microsoft had claimed, without ever specifying which ones, that Linux violated over 230 of its patents, a threat designed to make businesses afraid to adopt it. These were not the actions of a company that was going to become a good faith partner. But the financial logic was not subtle. By 2016, it was already clear that Azure was growing fast, that Linux was the dominant operating system on Azure, and that the more Linux ran well on Azure, the more money Microsoft made. Fighting Linux was not just futile, it was expensive. Every corporate customer that avoided Azure because they were nervous about Microsoft's relationship with Linux was revenue going to Amazon. Joining the Linux Foundation was not a philosophical conversion, it was arithmetic. And once that decision was made, everything else followed. Microsoft began contributing code to the Linux kernel. They built the Windows subsystem for Linux so developers who needed Linux tools would not have to leave Windows. They acquired GitHub, the platform where the majority of open source software on Earth is developed. They released their .NET development framework as open source. They built Azure Kubernetes Service, which runs on Linux. They began building their own internal Linux distribution, originally called CBL Mariner, to run their internal services. Each step looked incremental at the time. Together, they amounted to something nobody would have predicted in 2001, Microsoft becoming one of the largest contributors to the Linux ecosystem on Earth. But the full cost of the old strategy, the human cost of 2 decades of corporate warfare against the most popular operating system on the planet, that's a story that has not fully been told. And we're almost there. What changed the scale of this story from interesting to consequential was artificial intelligence. When OpenAI began scaling ChatGPT in 2022 and 2023, the infrastructure demands were unlike anything the commercial cloud had handled before. Training and running large language models requires not dozens or hundreds of servers, but tens of thousands, managed in parallel, with the kind of reliability and consistency that only Linux at scale could provide. Linux is what runs Kubernetes, the container orchestration system that manages how those workloads are distributed. Linux is what runs the underlying virtual machines. Linux is the foundation. Microsoft had made a multi-year investment of $10 billion into OpenAI. The deal was not just financial, it was infrastructure. OpenAI agreed to run its models on Azure. That meant Microsoft needed to provide the Linux infrastructure that could handle ChatGPT scaling to serve 1 billion queries a day. Think about what that meant in practice. Microsoft's biggest bet on the future of computing, the AI investment they have staked the company's next decade on, required Linux to work. If Linux had not been mature, stable, and available, the entire AI build-out would have gone somewhere else. Amazon, Google, both of whom had spent years building Linux infrastructure, while Microsoft had spent years resisting it. The acquisition of GitHub in 2018 deepened the dependency further. GitHub hosts over 300 million repositories of code. The overwhelming majority of that code is built to run on Linux. GitHub's own infrastructure runs on Linux, the platform through which Microsoft now influences the daily workflow of 100 million developers around the world is a Linux platform. And just weeks before the Azure Linux 4.0 announcement, Microsoft made another move that revealed exactly how deep the dependency runs. They open-sourced the Windows subsystem for Linux. For years, WSL had been a tool built by Microsoft engineers, improved partly by community contributions, but with its core code locked away. Opening that code was an admission that Microsoft now needed the open-source community's help to maintain the Linux integration that had become foundational to Windows itself. LinkedIn, which Microsoft also owns, migrated nearly all of its servers, virtual machines, and containers to Azure Linux by April of 2024, not to Windows Server, to Linux. The company that once declared Linux a cancer now has its flagship social network, its most important developer platform, its flagship AI product, and its cloud platform all running on Linux. The only major product that still runs primarily on its own operating system is Windows itself. And even Windows now ships with Linux built in. The dependency only runs one direction. Linux existed before Azure. Linux would exist if Azure disappeared tomorrow. The kernel that runs Microsoft's cloud was not built by Microsoft, is not owned by Microsoft, and cannot be controlled by Microsoft. Linus Torvalds does not need Satya Nadella's permission to release the next version. The $500,000 annual membership fee Microsoft pays to the Linux Foundation does not buy influence over the kernel. It buys a seat at a table where the agenda is set by engineers who answer to no corporation. Microsoft needs Linux to stay healthy, stable, and freely available. Linux needs nothing from Microsoft that it could not get from the thousands of other contributors who were there long before Microsoft arrived. The scale of this shift defies easy summary, but it's the human dimension, the people who felt the consequences of the old war, where the story becomes something more than a business case study. There is a man named Ken Starks. He spent years running a project called Reglu, a nonprofit in Texas that took donated computers, installed Linux on them, and gave them free to children from low-income families who could not afford Windows licenses. He wrote about what it was like to try to help those children in an era when Microsoft's corporate relationships with schools and businesses meant Linux computers were routinely incompatible with educational software, with online platforms, with file formats that the rest of the world was using. Every time a child brought a Reglu computer to school and could not open the assignment file because it was in a format only Microsoft Office would render properly, that was not an accident. That was the downstream consequence of a corporate strategy. Microsoft's patent threats against Linux vendors had real effects beyond boardroom negotiations. They created a chill across the industry. Companies that might have deployed Linux chose Windows because they feared legal exposure. Government agencies made the same calculation. For years, the total cost of Windows licenses represented a meaningful budget line for organizations that had no choice but to pay it. The developers who built their careers on Linux in the 90s and early 2000s, the engineers who chose open source because they believed software should be transparent, auditable, and free, watched Microsoft sponsor legal attacks on the movement they had built. Some of them never forgave it. In Linux forums and developer communities today, the skepticism about Microsoft's open source commitments runs deep. The phrase embrace, extend, extinguish, the theory that Microsoft would enter open source to eventually control and corrupt it, is still invoked every time Microsoft makes a new Linux-friendly announcement. That skepticism is not irrational. Microsoft's history earns it. But the financial reality cuts through the politics. When over 2/3 of your primary cloud revenue depends on Linux workloads, and when your most important AI infrastructure runs on Linux, you do not extinguish Linux. You cannot afford to. You become dependent on it. The open sourcing of WSL is the clearest signal yet of where the power actually lies. Microsoft did not open source WSL as an act of philosophical generosity. They opened it because the Linux community's contributions to WSL had made it better than Microsoft's engineers could make it alone, and they needed those contributions to continue. That is not a company in control of an ecosystem. That is a company asking for help from the ecosystem it once tried to destroy. For the users in this audience, the Windows users who have watched Microsoft force upgrades they did not want, remove features they relied on, and tie their computing lives ever more tightly to subscription services. This reversal contains something important. The alternative they were told was dangerous, and legally suspect has become the foundation of the most important computing infrastructure on Earth. The option they were pressured away from is the one that runs the internet, runs the cloud, and now, officially, runs Microsoft. It would be easy to read this story as a simple vindication of Linux over Microsoft. The reality is more complicated, and you deserve the honest version. The optimistic case for what Microsoft is doing with Linux is genuinely compelling. When a company with Microsoft's engineering resources, distribution reach, and enterprise relationships commits to a Linux distribution, it can make Linux better for everyone. Azure Linux 4.0, if it delivers on its promise of hardened security and consistent performance for cloud workloads, could raise the standard for what enterprise Linux looks like. The open sourcing of WSL makes Linux more accessible to the hundreds of millions of Windows users who are curious about it but have never taken the step. Microsoft's contributions to the Linux kernel, however commercially motivated, are real contributions to a shared code base that benefits every Linux user. There is also a serious argument that the open source community benefits from having major corporations financially dependent on Linux's continued health. When Microsoft's revenue depends on Linux not breaking, Microsoft has a powerful incentive to ensure Linux does not break. That is a form of support the Linux Foundation's founding engineers could never have predicted or funded through donations alone. The pessimistic case deserves equal weight. Microsoft's history of entering ecosystems with stated partnership intentions and then gradually reshaping them to serve Microsoft's commercial interests is long and well documented. The concern that an Azure-specific Linux distribution could fragment the ecosystem, could create dependencies that lock workloads into Azure in ways that are hard to reverse, is a legitimate strategic risk. The Linux Foundation has rules designed to prevent any single corporate member from gaining control, but rules do not override financial leverage. When 2/3 of an organization's relevance depends on one company's goodwill, independence is theoretical. There is also the unresolved question of Windows itself. None of this Linux success inside Microsoft has translated into anything that benefits Windows users on the desktop. Windows 11 still requires relatively new hardware. The telemetry, the advertising integration, the subscription pressures, none of that has eased. If anything, Microsoft's growing confidence that cloud and AI are the future has reduced whatever incentive they once had to compete for the loyalty of desktop users. Linux on the desktop remains a niche choice, not because it is inferior for most common tasks, but because the software ecosystem, the gaming infrastructure, and the hardware compatibility have historically been built around Windows. That is changing, but slowly. The honest summary is this: Microsoft's relationship with Linux has changed because Microsoft's financial interests changed. That is not the same thing as Microsoft changing. The correct response is neither to trust them completely nor to refuse to engage with what they are building. The correct response is to watch what they do, not what they say, and to make decisions about your own computing based on what actually serves you, not on loyalty to a company that has never been loyal back. We started this with Steve Ballmer calling Linux a cancer in 2001. We end it with Brendan Burns on a stage in Minneapolis in 2026, announcing that Microsoft's own Linux distribution is now available for every Azure customer on Earth. The platform running Microsoft 365, GitHub, and ChatGPT, all of it, every one of those products, sits, in Burns' own words, on Linux foundations. That is not irony, that is a verdict. The company spent over a decade and significant legal resources trying to limit the spread of something that turned out to be the foundation of the most important computing infrastructure ever built. And when the financial logic became impossible to deny, it did not fight the verdict. It joined the Linux Foundation, hired Linux kernel engineers, built its own Linux distribution, open-sourced its Linux compatibility layer, and stood on a stage and said so. Linux did not need Microsoft to survive. Linux survived the cancer comparison, the patent threats, the SEO litigation, the decades of doubt and corporate resistance, and came out the other side running the cloud, running AI, and now running Microsoft. The next video in this series is going to examine something you may find even more surprising than this one: the question of whether Windows itself has a future, or whether Microsoft's own internal choices are quietly building the case for its retirement. Because when the company that makes Windows runs its most important products on Linux, the question of what Windows is actually for becomes very difficult to answer. If this story matters to you, if you have ever felt the friction of a platform that treated your loyalty as a resource to be extracted rather than earned, then what comes next in this series is the video you need to watch.